My name's Kelly Austin. I'm married to Steve. And I'd like to thank, first of all, this wonderful church for hosting us, and for Creaticon for the privilege for myself and my husband to tell you about how the amazing honeybee and just how much we've learned about them and how they reveal to us the genius of God's creation. And I hope by the end of this talk you will too see that through them. I'm a physician at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. And like Pastor Paul, I feel in awe of the stars and the skies when I see that. But I also see evidence of creation all around me, and especially seem attracted to those examples through biology and biological organisms. And it seems like the more that I learn, the more I feel that I'm compelled and have evidence for kind of the basically the evidence of an extraordinary, all-powerful creator. And I hope that, again, you'll appreciate that by the end of this talk, just when we talk about the incredible honeybee. So first about the honeybee. I'm going to just give you a little background. This is some information or some video of where we live in Pennsylvania. And we started being beekeepers 7 years ago with 2 small hives. And this ultimately developed into something like 16 to 19 hives, depending on the year and what our winter losses. But just a little bit about them is that the beehive, each colony has its own separate hive, those little white body boxes there. And the thing about it is there's one queen who's fertile, and there's a few drones, and there's thousands of worker bees. And these make up the colony for the bees. But basically, I want you today to see the bees through the eyes as if you can imagine Beatrice, a beekeeper or a worker bee, telling you about her world through her own words. Okay, so I would like you to, if you will, entertain with me the possibility that this bee can talk. And imagine if she understood our world and could talk about her world in terms that we could understand. And I would like you to imagine that basically that she can talk to us only for about 50 minutes, so we really have to limit this discussion. I also want to talk about 8 major subjects that she would describe to us. And let's call them beatitudes, or for bee behavior. So we're going to talk about 8 subjects, and what about those? We'll get on to those. So first, friends call me Bee. I'm a skilled worker trained at my hive at Austin Farms, and I was told that you'd like to hear about my world. So Beatrice wants to describe, well, first of all, let's talk about things that we don't have time for, but that are just as significant. And I could talk a whole talk on honey, on beeswax, on self-medication that the bees do, on the importance to agriculture, and that roughly 1/3 at least of our food sources are responsible or pollinated by insects that are significant to us, and that the queen bee has a whole other area of interest. So we could talk about the social structure of the hive and democratic decision making. We can talk about swarming behavior and brood rearing and different pesticides and diseases, and also beekeeper agendas. But today we're going to focus on something else. We're going to talk about how the hive is a university for the bees, and how there's teachers and students. That a 1 whole inch opening to the hive separates 2 worlds for the bees. There's a specific agenda that the bees have, an occupation to be nectar collectors and pollen collectors, as well as almost multitasker pollinators. And I would say also precision navigators. And this is one of the most remarkable things that I think you'll learn from this. They have multiple sensors that help them sense their world, not just visual sensors such as color and ultraviolet evaluation, but they also have solar compasses, they can sense a solar clock and an odometer, basically the Swiss Army knife of sensors here. They can also, it's really important, not just visually, but odors they can sense. But they also have I'm going to call this a superhero sensor, just like the Spidey sense. They have an electrostatic sensor that's an image processor. I did what you told me not to do. There we go. All right, and they also, as they fly, they fly through tunnels and have a memory that tracks landmarks in space. There's many other cognitive skills, such as mathematics skills, and they all do this with a brain the size of a sesame seed. So it's pretty remarkable. Makes you wonder if these are just purely instinctual organisms. So first of all, Beatrice wants you to know that dedication to her hive is her top priority. And she basically learns what she needs to know, and it's intentional. And with this training and with her use of her sensors, she accomplishes remarkable tasks. From the moment that a young bee emerges into the hive, this is roughly 21 days after the egg was laid by the queen. They emerge from the brood cell, which was their cell of birth, so to speak. From the moment they emerge, they are started to be taught how to be a good worker bee. And these worker bees are initially serve various roles, and there's multiple roles in the hive. One of the roles is the nursing bee. They also this is a bee that will see those open cells, that will cap those open cells with something called bee bread, which is a mixture of nectar and honey and pollen that helps, that helps the egg and larva grow during their gestation, so to speak. And with this, that provides adequate nutrition. There's also clean bees that have a cleaning behavior that basically clean the hive out. The young bees also learn how to cool and warm down the brood to keep it just the right temperature. If it's too hot, they cool it down with evaporation. And if it's too cold, they warm it up with friction. Down? Okay. The young bees also are responsible, ultimately, for building a honeycomb or comb that's imparted to the hive. And they start by doing this in groups. They learn how to make festooning, which is the behavior that you see here, with joining together to each other to communicate with each other. And they have teams that lay down the honey, the beeswax. After just the right temperature, they excrete some wax on their bellies through 8 little glands that are pocket-like. They collect them up, and one of them will chew it up a little bit, warm it up, and then lay it down. A second bee will actually start the drawing out process, and the third bee will complete the comb. And it has to be just the right, such that the end result is a hexagonal or 6-shaped cavity there that actually is also specifically angled to hold the honey in and not let it fall. The interesting thing about this is it's got to be perfectly made just right, so that it's optimized, so that you have the best amount of holding power with the least amount of substrate. So essentially, like 1 pound or 1 kilogram of wax, roughly 2.2 pounds of of beeswax, will hold something like 22 kilograms or 50 pounds of honey. It's pretty remarkable, and it's the most efficient, strongest structure that could be made. So this is when they use the combs, not just for their brood, but they also use it to lay down nectar, and they have to learn how to desiccate the nectar. So the nectar is roughly 80% water, and they have to dehydrate that nectar and make it down to something like 18% water, and that converts it into honey. They also have just the right chemistry and enzymes that after they take this nectar and turn it into what we know as honey. So this is some of the juvenile bees, or worker bees doing that just right now. And eventually they get honed in and have learned how to do this over time, that they become graduates. And now they've graduated from the hive, and they learn to, as they get older, they become more likely to venture outside. They feel like they've now graduated to become forager bees and scout bees. So this is the exciting part to us, is one of the, all of that's remarkable. But in addition, now they have to actually leave this protected environment of their hive and fly away. And, they've never been outside before. How do they know exactly how to do that? They have to leave a 1-inch hole, roughly diameter hole at the front of their hives. And through this, they leave into the big, bright world of the outside. So This is a quick example. We have this going fast. It's very hectic. This is a slow motion example. And you see them coming back into the hive. They take turns. It's nice to have a smaller hole because that's good defense. They can defend that hole against things like yellow jackets and hornets. And so some of the bees internally are guard bees and actually will fight for foreigners coming in. These bees, you can see the yellow pollen on their legs. They've collected pollen and put them in little sacs on their hind legs. And they take off, you see them coming and going. So now that they've graduated, Beatrice says, my chief purpose is to, my occupation is to forage the field and collect nectar, pollen for my hive. And I'm such a good not multitasker that I basically am able to successfully pollinate flowers in the meantime while I'm doing this. Okay, so not only am I achieving the collection of food for my hive, but I'm also facilitating the flowers to grow more flowers to make me have more nectar and more pollen. It's amazing, right? So not only that, but like I said, it's not insignificant to us also, because we as humans eat food that roughly 1/3 of our food is dependent on pollinators for that. So we benefit from this amazing multitasking. So as the bee flies out into the world, she basically has to recognize where she's heading. And this is something where the polarized light sensor helps illuminate her, giving her a sense of time and distance through that time. And I'll explain this in a second. So the angle of the sun's polarization constantly changes over the course of the day, and maybe the bee is outside her hive for roughly 8 hours during that time. The sun is going to change its polarization relative to the earth, roughly 90 degrees maybe during the time that the bee is out there, and this helps give the bee a sense of time. And so it's a solar compass, so to speak, and a solar clock. So even in a cloudy day, all the bee needs is a little bit of sunlight to keep track of their orientation. Bees don't go foraging at nighttime; they're only out during the day. So when a bee finds a really wonderful source of nectar, a scout bee specifically, and only roughly 5 to 25% of the bees are scout bees. When they find out about this, they come back, and this is really wonderful that they've discovered that they have a form of communication to the rest of the hive. And actually, Karl von Frisch from Germany here was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1973 for essentially for this discovery that there's something called a waggle dance. And I'm going to, if you'll permit me to use this as a little waggle dance bee. So if the source of nectar is roughly 50 meters or less, there's mostly just a circle that the bee will do around. And how fast they run around determines the type, or the distance, I should say. But if it's greater than 75 meters, typically, the bee will actually start a figure of 8, so to speak. I can't do this quite well, I suppose. But in this part, in the center, they'll angle this, it's an azimuth, basically, angle along the comb, the vertical path, to the angle of which direction the bee should fly outside of the hive. And they even know how to do this as it gets darker. The longer they're inside the hive, they turn their angle appropriately to the sun. So the waggle, this line here, is done in the direction that the bee, the next forager needs to go to find the actual honey. I mean the nectar, and the honey source. So the more rapid that they do this motion, and the more with more zeal, so to speak, means the kind of the excitement and the farther it is away. And that tells the bees just how far to go. That's extremely impressive that the bees are such communicative organisms. And then on top of that, you can say, well, okay, once they're out there and they find it, how do they find their way home? I mean, this is a whole other question, like how do they learn how to find their way home? Nobody really told them how to get back, or do they know this? So I'm going to get back to this in a second through the process that we're going to discuss here, and that it turns out that bees on number 5 have the superhero spidey sense, so to speak, with the hairs all over their body that are electrostatic sensors. And this electrostatic sensation gives them another way to interpret the world. And, they can walk or fly around, the world, and they can add this electrostatic sensor onto their optical world, and this helps them, much like maybe dogs are attracted to smells, this is a very strong sense that they will have. And it's something that we know a little bit about, but not very much. This is a head of a bumblebee, and the honeybees are similar in that there's not just sensors all around its head, but also in its antenna. And the antennas can actually have very good sensation. So on rare occasions, we can reproduce, we understand what electrostatic electricity is, I should say, where you can do an experiment where you take a balloon and you rub your hair, and if you have a lot of pieces of paper, maybe you can close and you can see that discharge, you can see the papers be attracted to the balloons. Just like you can also do this on fur or whatnot, you can do this experiment if you like. I don't know if you'll hear this, but there's also something called St. Elmo's fire, where there's static electricity in the air, and especially in this situation, this person's experiencing the electricity that's coming off of her hands, the discharge, and it's making crackling sounds. You're very close to lightning strikes if this is happening to you. And it's probably best thing to do is to quickly get out of this charged environment and get very...
I don't like how it feels. I'm putting my hat back.
So it's a little scary. So that's very important in that could bees have this process? And well, of course, bees actually do amazingly is that as the bee flaps and flies, its wings flap very quickly, it pushes away electrons and becomes positively charged. So be positive. If you ever remember that, just be positive, right? So and it's amazing that the flowers are naturally negatively charged as the ground is. And so surprisingly, and maybe not so surprisingly, because we know there's a person or God who knows what they're doing. We have flowers that are negatively charged, bees that are positively charged, and a bee can see electrostatic image of the world and be attracted to flowers. So here is an example of flowers that were dusted with positive dust, and this attached to the flowers. For example, the positive dust is the blue, and you can see even closer the areas where the pollen would be obtained, like around here, and also the petals to attract the bees closer to them. All the positive dust is sticking on the edge, and here there's maybe some yellow dust. And this is from an experiment by Clark, Marley, and Robert. And we have a few other images from them today as well. So when the bee sees this flower, they basically see not just a colorful flower or an ultraviolet flower, but they see an electrostatic flower. And as they get closer, there's even a stronger attachment, so to speak, or discharge from the flower. And this actually lets the pollen almost leap off the flower onto the bee. And it aids the bee and it discharges that negative flower. So the bee is the hairs of the electrostatic sensor basically not only helps the bee hone in on the flower, but it also helps them attract, obviously optimally designed. So even to make matters even more interesting, when a bee comes and actually gathers pollen from one particular flower, they discharge that flower. And so the second bee says, I'm not going to spend much time with this flower. It's already been seen, right? This flower doesn't have much for me here. There's not much pollen left, and I'm going to be efficient and go to the flower that I know can give me some pollen. So it's pretty remarkable, right? I mean, it's just amazing. So basically, Beatrice wants you to know that in addition to that, she knows how to get home because she also has a significant tunnel memory. And basically, as she flies through the sky, she's not just having a three-dimensional world, leaves a lasting memory on her brain, and essentially it picks up landmarks. She's able to pick up various landmarks that she commits to memory that helps her have shortcuts home. And There have been a variety of different experiments that they can put bees in virtual reality in little tunnels that they create various looks, see, and they can recognize different points along the way. And they also get electrostatic overlay upon this. And for example, if you add the polarization into it, as you see on this first image, this is, with the light a certain place here, and then this is a different way, so that helps them with the direction on the way home. So navigation and language are just a few of the cognitive skills that bees can comprehend. They also can understand symbols. They can understand images and patterns and faces. And a lot of this research has been done here in Germany. It's pretty impressive. They even know how to do logic problems. They know how to add and subtract. And, this is, if you really think about it, if you could modify a steering wheel and a brake, you could basically get a bee to drive. They have all the cognition to do that. Basically, just to read this definition, a cognition is mental action or process of acquiring knowledge, understanding through thought, experiences, and the senses. It encompasses many intellectual functions and processes such as perception, attention, formation of knowledge, memory, working memory, judgment, evaluation, reasoning, computation, problem solving, decision making, and production of language. This is what our honeybees do. So they become expert at recognizing terrain and memorizing specific patterns and knowing how to get back to their home. They can even use, we can use mazes to examine bees and to train them, and also to see if they can learn. And this is one of the situations where they'll have them come through the little hole, the initial little hole here, and they'll recognize a symbol, and that symbol will tell them either to add or subtract. And then they'll either go into the right hole based on the symbol and get rewarded. And over time, they can change this all up, and basically they know exactly what they're doing. So essentially, like for example, in this, the yellow might be subtraction, and they will tell them to subtract, and that means the bee is supposed to go into the correct answer. And they can change up the color to blue, and the same thing based on symbols or whatnot, and they'll learn how to add or subtract based on the demand of this. It's really pretty interesting. Bees do, and this is one of the things beekeepers know as well. If you're sitting at home and you have some jam, eventually bees, if you do this regularly at the same time of day, you might get frequented by more and more bees the same time of day based on what you're having there. This is an anecdotal story of Dave. Dave works with us, and he remembers when he first started cutting the grass near the beehives that he would be a little apprehensive. The bees were kind of not as happy with him. He would get stung once or twice. But, if you entertain me, he basically planted many of these wonderfully flowering trees in the area near the hive, and ultimately he's less scared of the bees now because he feels that the bees recognize him. And actually that is not so far-fetched. This is roughly 20,000 plus bees in a swarm, maybe. But it is true that bees can recognize and remember faces. And studies have come out that the honeybee can discriminate between different individual human faces. Whether that's protected Dave or not, I'm not sure. But it's good for him to think that. So our bees also recognize artistic styles. They can tell the difference between Monet's and Picasso paintings consistently. It's just incredible that they can do so much. So when we get back to it, bees have amazing precision navigating skills. They have intentionality. They know what they're going after. They have memory. They know their beginning point. I showed you all those hives. Each bee comes back to just their own hive. It doesn't come back to a neighbor's hive. It comes back to their own hive. They have landmarks. They know the routes that they've gone. They often have signs and interpretations. They can tell the distance, speed, and time. They can turn and use shortcuts. They can avoid obstacles. They have destination recognition. They load cargo, and they can return. So they might well just be drivers, right? And if they did drive, what do you think the kind of car they would drive? I think the BMW sounds good. But you might rather be a Humvee, so we'll see based on this. So anyway, it's the last remarkable thing, the eighth beatitude, is that everything this bee does is extremely amazing in size with a brain the size of a sesame seed. And in that brain, there's roughly just under 1 million neurons, something like 960,000 neurons. Well, they have pretty remarkable images already of the bee brain. And much of the brain is sitting there kind of, I would put this here, kind of overlaying the frontal image of it, is related to the optic or the eye input. And, it's also true that bees do better with flickering movements. And so as the flower is flickering, they actually have more success as opposed to a still flower. And some of this is the stimulation that the bee sees as it flies. So if you have noticed that now there's even lots more coming out about this and the unexpected brilliance of the world's tiniest brains and the insects, and they're starting to realize a 1 millimeter squared insect brain is not as dumb as once thought, so to speak. And if you think about, there's over 1 billion neurons in a human brain. I guess you think about the extraordinary power in these little brains. So while there's not quite 1 million neurons, it has significant amount of power. And you wonder what we can do with our brains. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So just in recap, the bee has, the Beatitudes, I'd like to say, is the Hive is a university, and with teachers and students. That the 1-inch hole is basically a portal between two worlds. The bee has an occupation to collect nectar and pollen. Nectar is mostly their carbohydrate source, and pollen is predominantly their protein source. But they're also a precision navigator to achieve those. And almost, but not quite, they're amazingly, their goal is to gather their own food source, but they achieve pollination in the process. They have amazing sensors. In addition to their visual and smell sensors, they obviously have a solar compass and a solar clock and an odometer to know their speed. They have a superhero, electrostatic image processor. I mean, these are only the few things we know. Like I said about before, the more and more I learn, the more and more I appreciate just this creation. They have a tunnel memory tracks tunnel memory that actually helps them track landmarks in space, and so many other remarkable cognitive skills, all within a small brain. So the one thing that, I'm going to get started, I'm also going to ask Steve to come up here too, is you could argue, you could question, how does something like this happen in a worker bee that's infertile? This worker bee is not passing on this knowledge to generations after generations after generations. This is brought up by, only one queen in each hive. So the queen only lasts so long. So it makes you wonder about this. I just think that this was a very big problem for Charles Darwin. And he had a problem with the beekeepers because he really couldn't explain natural selection, as there's no real natural selection in this process. And the beekeepers that he knew worked with him on this and said, kind of argued with him and gave him an actual glass-walled observation hive. And Darwin believed that, this was going to be hard to explain in that in his world, what he was thinking as hardwired behavior, as simple instinct, was going to be hard to defend and the more he learned about bees. And because of it, because of this advanced cognition that the bees were showing, he understood that bees had a language. He understood that they had some skill in learning. He understood that they, somehow communicated to each other the best food sources. And this made him delay the actual origin of species for roughly 10 years because he was trying to figure out, because he felt that he was going to get too much slack, but then ultimately competition pushed him away or pushed him into getting the publication out because he didn't want to get scooped. So this also, Darwinism also promoted the behavioral psychology that poisoned the social science of the 20th century, unfortunately. And that incredibly creationist thoughts of beekeepers in the 1850s kept predicting features of the honeybee and its design, and basically how it basically contributed to even more of our discoveries of honeybee cognition. I'm going to have Steve finish up here in 2 seconds, because this is something that he felt.
Okay, why did God give a bee a brain of 960,000 neurons, but give a human, what, a brain of 100 billion neurons? 100,000 times more neurons than a bee. And a bee can do all of these amazing things. So are you interested in that question? I've been interested in that question a lot. And I thought about it, and the book of Job kind of is remarkable. And but why does Job have a brain of 100 billion neurons? Good question. Well, think about that, and then the story of the book of Job. Bad things start happening to Job, a lot of bad things. And his wife comes to him and says, curse God and die. And then he says, well, hey, should we not accept the blessings as well as the trouble from God? And then 3 comforters come. And he gets in a dialogue about God's purposes, right? And the comforters say, hey, your integrity is your problem with God. You know, you've got a problem with God. It's not God's problem, it's your problem. But Job knows what? That he has integrity, and he's been operating properly. And so he is in this point of crisis, and he starts questioning God. And what happens? The book of Job, chapter 38 happens. God shows up, and what? Asks the right questions. And Job responds. And right there in the end of the book of Job, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And that's probably why God gave Job a what? 100 billion neurons in his brain, is to understand when God shows up. And yeah, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And then as we think about the brain of a bee, we think about how efficient that amazing sesame seed-sized brain is, you know, in our brain. And so God gave us brains to what? Understand when God shows up. And, you know, God is creator, and he showed up, and he wants us to understand it. And that's what bees communicate to me.
And it communicates to me that evidence is all around us if we just are honest to appreciate it. So thank you.
Okay.